I'm your host, Chidi Erike, and this is the 10th installment of Facebook Auction Live and the first installment of Breakthrough, the series. So I have my esteemed guests to my right, both Justin and Matt. We're just going to kick things off. I also have a special guest later on. We've never had an actual client join us, right, live. So I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, so I'll let him introduce himself later. But Justin, let's start off with you. So what is the Breakthrough series?
Yeah, so Breakthrough is first off, hi, nice to see everybody out there. Breakthrough is an educational series that we have here at Facebook that helps some of our fastest growing advertisers make sure that the foundations are set, because we've seen what explosive growth they can have if they really lean into our system. And so Breakthrough originally was an in-person event where you could see how these systems work together, how your signals and how you optimize connects to your measurement and to your creative, and see how that whole story gets put together. And we've seen such great success from that. We wanted to bring it to more people, and that's why we're here today.
Thank you. And Matt, we used to be on the same auction team. Can you explain a little bit about the work that you're doing right now before I jump into the agenda?
Yeah, so I lead a team of client-facing data scientists that work with advertisers to help them optimize their performance in our auction. So my team focuses on the mechanics of the auction and really what you should do to grow and perform better.
So today's agenda, we have a nice little slide for you guys. We're going to discuss account simplification, targeting design, CBO, and the learning phase. All right, but I want to start with account simplification. What is account simplification?
I'll take that one. So account simplification, I think first and foremost, it's important to note that this isn't a product, right? This is kind of a mindset. It's an approach to how you buy on Facebook. And because of that, really what we're at its core, what it is reducing the number of ad sets you have, or the number of campaigns, the number of ad sets, and the number of ads. What that allows us to do is remove all the constraints from our system and let Facebook's decision making, our delivery optimization, really pool more conversions together and make better choices for you. What that means is that when those constraints are removed, it simply works. And we've seen this work on small advertisers, big advertisers, advertisers that have really high cost per action or cost per purchase, really low. And so we've seen, because it has worked really for everyone that we've worked with, we want to make sure that we focus on that today and what it allows. And account simplification, again, it's about reducing those ad sets. It's about removing those redundancies and removing those constraints so that you're able to let Facebook do what it does best so that you can do what you do best, and testing new ways to bring your product to market.
And how should one think about consolidation?
Yeah, so consolidation and that constraint removal at its core is really about targeting first, but there's also things around bids and budgets and making sure you're reducing those redundancies. So let's say you have a few ad sets. One ad set is targeting, let's say, basketball, and another ad set is targeting Michael Jordan. Probably not a lot of difference between those audiences, and there's not any value in separating those out. But actually, you're going to introduce those constraints in our system. We're not going to be able to see the conversions happening in one or the actions taken in one is not helping the other. And what that happens is now we don't have as much data to use to make decisions on your behalf. And we've seen our systems advance so much over the last few years that pooling those together, allowing those conversions come together, allows us to maximize your performance. And most importantly, it gives you time back, right? And so when we talk about consolidation, it means remove those redundancies that force you to go in and kind of move a lot of knobs, change things manually, because that takes a lot of time and attention away from either you, if you're an advertiser or a company or a marketing team. It's a lot of time. That's one of your most valuable assets. And what we've seen through that consolidation and simplification is you get a ton of time back to do some of the fun things and some of the great tests that you want to, that because Facebook is making those decisions on your behalf, and you're getting better performance because of it.
Yeah, that's an excellent description. And there's going to be a ton of questions on consolidation, on account simplification. So as a reminder to the audience, please start asking your questions now if you haven't already. Please just add them in there, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. So now to you, Matt. If you could take us through how the platform has evolved over time when it comes to actually looking at consolidation or the learning phase or anything account simplification for that matter, How would you say that?
Of course, yeah. I think one thing we should focus on here is the power of machine learning. So machine learning at Facebook has gotten incredibly powerful over the last couple of years. One of the things that we used to tell advertisers many years ago was, hey, come to our platform, you can have all of these different interest targets, and you could find people in all of these unique situations you may want to reach. Now, those are still there and still available if folks want to use them, but what we see is that advertisers that lean into broad targeting, that really let the system decide who to deliver to, are performing better. And so through this is consolidation. And of course, consolidation here means that we're consolidating not only our ad sets, but really fundamentally our signal, right? So the signal is really what fuels our machine learning engine. And by having all of the signal together, we can deliver better performance because we understand both who to deliver to and more importantly, who not to deliver to on our system.
Yeah, and on the signal part, account simplification, map route and signal. And one of the great things we've seen over the last year is something we call Power 5. It's something we talk about at the breakthrough events and with a lot of the verticals here. Account simplification is one part of that. Campaign budget optimization, which we'll talk about later, is also part of that. It's really about how do we maximize those signals and lean into Facebook's machine learning and the ability for us to make those decisions and simplifying your approach so that we maximize the signal we're getting from each and every ad set is a core part of that Power 5, and account simplification is a big part of that.
How important is signals in general?
Signal is incredibly important. Signal is, as I said, the fuel behind everything we do. The brilliance of machine learning is that I like to make the analogy, if you give me a book and 50% of the pages are missing, I can probably fill that book in. I can probably tell you the total story, the complete story. However, if you give me a book and 90% of the pages are missing, I probably can't fill in enough to figure out the story. So really what Signal is doing for us is letting us get to a point where we can understand that total story from a limited amount of information, and then from that extrapolating to more people on our platform and giving the right ad to the right person at the right time.
Yeah, and also, for Signal and account simplification as a whole, I think a lot of the hesitation here and why we've seen it work so broadly is you have to remove your hands out of the system a bit. You have to give a little bit of control up in order to maximize your performance, which we know is a big leap of faith for a lot of people, or they are hesitant to do it. But we know that when less action is taken and less optimizations are made manually and you're pulling these things together, that there are better outcomes. I like the analogy of soccer goalies in that when they have penalty kicks, it's like 90% of the time they either jump left or right, but 36% of shots are straight down the middle. So sometimes just sitting there and keeping your staying still is actually the best play on a percentage basis. But a lot of times we feel like we have to take actions when we don't actually. It doesn't actually lead to better outcomes. And so account simplification kind of leans into that. If you structure your account in a certain way, you actually won't have to do as much work to yield the same amount of gains.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. What do you guys think are some of the challenges with account simplification?
So some of the challenges to account simplification might be existing reporting structures. So you may structure your account because you want to have a reporting framework that lets you break down by those individual audiences. I like to say that's fine if that's a business requirement. Just know that there is a cost in our system to doing that, right? Breaking down that way means that our system is less efficient in your delivery, and so will be challenging to maximize performance given that structure. So that's one of the reasons I often hear on my side for why folks might do it.
And also, it's where do we start, right? So the hard part is, where do you start when you want to simplify? And I think we want to focus on we know advertisers, large and small, have different pools of goals, right? So you may be trying to drive brand awareness, you may be trying to drive sales. We want you to think about simplification within each one of those buckets. We don't want you to say, well, I have 10 or dozens or hundreds or thousands of ad sets, and so I need to break that down and just have one or two. We want you to think about each individual goals, and then within those goals, have you simplified enough? Have you reduced the redundancies that aren't adding any value, where it's just copies of one another, and it makes you maybe feel like you're having impact by changing budgets or changing bids or creating these hyper-targeting segments. But in actuality, it's kind of introducing a little bit of chaos into the system and some randomness that you won't be able to replicate as you try to scale out your business. So within each one of those buckets, that's where you should start and say, for my campaigns, for my ad sets that are trying to drive conversions, drive purchases, drive app installs, you want to look and reduce it there, and then move to the next bucket, right? And so you don't have to do it all at the same time. You don't have to do them all into one goal. We want you to allow that simplification. One of the best parts about Facebook is the breadth of objectives that we can serve. We can serve someone that's trying to reach a really broad audience, drive a brand message, drive that brand loyalty and brand love, or someone that's trying to drive a deep funnel signal and get a lead in order to, sell an insurance quote or something like that. We have that whole stack is what Facebook is great at. We still want you to tap into all of that power, but within each one of those buckets, you should think about that consolidation first. And breaking down the structure usually gives someone their first step in how to move into that simplification approach.
To that point, do you think a simplification approach is more valuable to larger advertisers or smaller advertisers?
It's hard to say without a specific example.
Yeah.
I would say we've seen it work for every advertiser, right?
Yeah,
In some cases, if you have way too many ad sets and you're splitting these things out, Matt's going to talk a lot about the learning phase later, which should give you a signal. If you're spending too much time there, that's more important than whether you're large or small. Our system is fair and equal to everybody. That's what we love about it. And so whether you're a big advertiser or a large advertiser, all of these systems and constraints are the same, right? And so naturally, if you're a larger advertiser, you probably have more likelihood of an opportunity for simplification. But we've seen smaller advertisers or small businesses maybe overthink it, and account simplification really, I think, at its core, is for them. It's so that they have time back to serve their business and not worry about making optimizations on Facebook to drive their business. We should be able to do that for you so that you can focus on your customers and focus about bringing them value. We'll try to, and if you simplify, we'll bring you the most value to your business without you having to do too much work.
Well said. So we actually have an advertiser joining us today that's actually going to speak through this some more. Michael, why don't you come over here and join us? So Michael is joining us from Bombas. Michael, if you could take a brief moment to introduce yourself, and then we could tee up the case study that we're going to talk about.
Sure. My name is Michael McTighe, and I'm the Senior Paid Social Manager at Bombas. I've been working at Bombas for about 1.5 years now. And when I joined, it happened to be at the exact time that Bombas was selected to join Facebook's Disruptors group. So I've been really lucky to be able to work with Arian and the incredible team here on some really cool projects. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you. And what does disruptors mean to you?
Yeah, so we're going to get into the test that we ran. I think it's a great example of what disruption means at Bombas. So the entire test, from when we rolled out the test plan to get an internal approval to go on live on Facebook, only took 3 days. And it's because our CMO is constantly pushing us to test and innovate and find ways to move our efforts forward, especially when there really hasn't been a more competitive time in the digital landscape. So that's what disruption means to us.
So this test was absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
23x increase in sales per ad set. You're going to have to walk me through that.
Yeah, so going into the test, as soon as I kind of took over the account, I noticed that there was a significant amount of audience overlap. We had about 70 plus campaigns, pretty much structured like every other account I had ever worked on. And I was worried that this was really hurting our ad efficiency. So I came to the team here and we reviewed it, came up with a test plan where we essentially tested our existing efforts. So we defined it as BAU, so business as usual, 70 plus campaigns, versus a much more simplified and consolidated approach with just 2 ad sets. So as for the test setup itself, the main hypothesis was that we would be able to increase our scale at a higher efficiency since we would have a much stronger conversion signal, kind of to what Justin was talking about. And in order to do this, we had 2 ad sets. So it may look different for everyone, but to start, we only launched with one broad, so no other targeting parameters. We let the system find what our core customer looked like, and another 1% lookalike built off of our top customers. And you just showed the slide. We ran it for 2 weeks, 23x the sales. I was really excited for it to be over because we quickly like pivoted to a simplified approach, and those results are from a year and a half ago. So we've had the same approach for a year and a half, and it continues to drive results for our business.
That's amazing. How long did it take you to actually pivot? So you got the learnings now, and then did you execute it immediately, or did it?
Yeah. So once we used the conversion split tool to split the Facebook universe in two. Once that was over, we basically killed all the ads in the old account and just pivoted to our existing efforts. And performance only took off from there too, because it wasn't diverting any spend to less efficient ads at that point. We really ramped up.
It sounds like you went from 75 ad sets to 2. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
How does that change your day to day?
So time, like you said, basically simplification has eliminated about 90% of my day-to-day optimizations. So we're a growing team. We're hiring like crazy, but we're still a very lean team. So time is incredibly valuable for a startup, and this has allowed me to take a step back and focus on more strategic initiatives and further tests. I think a great example of this is earlier last year, we had another case study around audience network. Being able to find better ways to amplify the already simplified approach. We had an Instagram stories test last month that was really exciting results, and something I know you've worked on. We have a Facebook Messenger pilot coming next month with our awesome marketing partner Paloma. So a lot of exciting things.
Yeah, did you say 90% time?
Yeah.
That's I mean,
you definitely miss it, having those levers, but all of a sudden, like overnight, it was as if we 5x'd our team because of all that additional bandwidth.
Yeah, that's incredible, right? So when you think about the future, right, and you think about testing, it seems like testing is embedded in your culture. What kind of advice would you give to other advertisers when they're thinking about testing the simplified structure?
Yeah, this is something we go back and forth on internally a lot. In order to stay true to a simplified approach, testing can be extremely challenging. I think if you look at simplification as the foundation of what you're doing on Facebook, you should either launch tests that will supplement your existing efforts, right, that probably aren't competing, you're removing the redundancies, or you should, launch tests with the mindset that it will have an impact on overall performance. But if you value the learnings, it's kind of worth it in the long run. It's just like short-term versus long-term gain. My advice to other advertisers would be to utilize Facebook's reporting breakdowns and look to see when the bulk of your conversions are coming in, because you want to launch any tests at the peak time where volume is much higher, because an example would be there's enough to go around. There will be enough conversions that it'll really mitigate any impact on overall performance. So you really just want to be strategic of when you're launching these tests. Otherwise, you have to keep in mind that there will be some overlap and potential impact.
I like that approach. I think one of the questions we get a lot on testing is well, what's everyone else doing, or what's the optimal time? Should I do this at midnight? Should I do it at 9 a.m.? How many ads should I run in each ad set? And I love your guys' approach of kind of listening to what's been happening, and that's what true insight and analysis is saying what's been working for us and then designing a system around that. So that's just an awesome approach that you guys take.
It's going to be different for every advertiser, but for us, it's pretty clear. These are the times, and this is when we plan out ahead of time. If we're going to launch a test, we're not going to do it now. We're going to wait until the peak time.
As a client partner on the Disruptors team, oftentimes I get asked, okay, what is the budget that I should set for these types of tests before I can actually move forward and start making significant changes that are going to impact performance? What would you say to that?
So I would say the testing budget's obviously going to be different than your overall approach, because those are proven concepts. But as far as testing, your budget will kind of limit, and budgets are usually safety nets, right? You don't want to overspend. But your budget may limit how many learnings you're potentially able to get and how quickly. But typically, just as a safe measure, we follow the 25x ratio that Facebook has recommended in the past. But again, it is different, and it is concerning what you're trying to accomplish. But just keeping that in mind, it's at least 25, just so that there are no additional constraints on the system.
Wow.
Yeah, So I can chat about this from an auction perspective. So how we like to think about it in the auction is that fundamentally what we want our ads to do is to get to 50 conversions. And so 50 conversions in our eyes is about where you'll see performance stabilize and you'll be out of what we call the learning phase. And so typically when we think about how to set up a budget for an ad, it's really focused around, hey, let's ideally get to 50 and in a perfect case, let's get to at least 100 conversions for that particular ad before we decide if that ad is performing well or not. Because of course, early on in the life cycle of an ad, we're exploring how to deliver it. And so one of the things I always like to emphasize is it's not really a time-based component. It's more or less based on the rate of conversions that we see coming in. And if we can get to that number of 50 or ideally even more, then we can feel pretty confident in the results we're seeing in the ad set in question.
All right. Justin, you have anything to add to that?
I don't. No.
All right, cool. So that actually brings me to liquidity, because liquidity is extremely important, and this is going to be relevant to everybody who's here. So, Michael, let's start with you. How important is liquidity to you? And when I say liquidity, I'm mainly talking about placement optimization and campaign budget optimization.
Yeah. So placement optimization is something I could speak to. It only enhanced our simplified approach, and Justin and Matt talked to before. As a business, we're trying to get as many efficient conversions as possible. So we don't really value the placements differently. And by opting into all placements, we're basically, again, removing the constraints and letting the system deliver wherever that first impression is going to be cheapest, where someone's likely to take the desired result.
Yeah.
So again, it's kind of like taking something that's already pretty simplified and just giving it even more opportunity. Throughout the conversation today, it's going to be really removing constraints.
Yeah.
We've seen so the case study was based on when we didn't have placement optimization in place. So it would have been even greater than 23x because we saw a giant lift in all of these new opportunities that we weren't previously capturing. And there's a lot of talk of CPMs rising. If you're focused on decreasing your costs, you shouldn't be limited in value in something that hasn't really proven to be different in value internally.
And we talked about, or I mentioned our Power 5 earlier, and one we're not going to explicitly talk about, but was brought up, was automatic placements. That's another one of those that really leans into removing those constraints from the system. But I'll jump in on the other side of it, campaign budget optimization, which, campaign budget optimization, again, removing constraints, giving you back more time. This one is really about focus on maximizing the efficiency of your media, and then making sure your organization, whether that's an individual person or a group of people, that they're getting the most time back, so that your organization is also as efficient as possible. How it does this is it allows the budget for all of your ads to be set at the campaign level when historically they've been set at the ad set level, and it allows us to kind of move budget between those targets, between those ad sets. And there's some constraints that there's probably some links being posted in the comments that you can read about some of the constraints on this. What it does is it tries to move the budget, one, where it's most efficient, but two, and this is a real differentiator, where we believe volume will be possible in the future, right? Because just because one ad set is getting really cheap volume right now doesn't mean that it's going to be able to get cheap volume in the future. And campaign budget optimization is not just reactive, looking at what's happening, it's proactive. It's looking at the likelihood that an audience between, let's say, ad set A and ad set B will come online, and then we'll move budget based on that prediction. And so if a whole bunch of people show up on ad set B all of a sudden, we'll be able to move money over there. Where if you wanted to do that, let's say it's a big holiday, it's Black Friday, right? You'd have to jump in and watch the ad sets like a hawk and move money between them. And maybe you can do it, right? Maybe you can do that. What's going to happen is you're going to reset our learning phase, which Matt will talk about in a little bit and has brought up already. And what that does is it means we have to relearn some of these things. The great value add of campaign budget optimization is it makes these moves without actually resetting the learning phase, because it's allowing us to move that money. And we're only doing so when we're confident. Right, confidence is a big part of the system. Confident that it'll drive more volume for you at a cheaper price. And so when you think about campaign budget optimization, don't just think about, well, is it moving money where it's where it's most efficient, one is yes, it is. Time and time again, all of our tests show that it does do that. But it also looks at where can I maximize volume and maximize performance, because those are always trade-offs, right? And so as it moves money, you have to think about, or it moves your investment from one ad set to the other. It's doing that because it believes more people will come online, more of that volume will come online, and you wouldn't be able to do that yourself as proactively as the system can, because it's looking ahead at what these audiences will do within each ad set. It's really a great feature. This is an actual product rather than account simplification. Again, is that concept at higher level, how you approach Facebook. Campaign budget optimization is just really some secret sauce to make that account simplification work even harder on your behalf.
And so before we move on to Matt, Justin, one more question, because I think you basically addressed this. One of the questions from the live feed is, why does CBO still allocate larger budgets to lower performing ad sets for long periods? Right. So I think you somewhat touched about that, but
sure. Yeah, I think this is a concept we call the breakdown effect. I think we have a slide for the breakdown effect, but what that means is why we call it a breakdown is actually breakdowns in ads reporting. So if you break this down, this is for placement optimization, or let's say Instagram versus Facebook newsfeed, or between ad sets in the case of campaign budget optimization, it may look like Facebook was allocating spend to something that was less performing, but it's actually about maximizing volume across the entire group, right? Across all of the ad sets and not just the individual. Why this concept is important is, on that slide, you probably saw a rate of change. So we're not just looking at the overall performance, we're looking at as we scaled your budget from, let's say, $100 to $1,000, how did efficiency change from ad set A to ad set B, or what would we predict it to be? And the breakdown effect looks at that, not only the volume that's possible, but the rate of change as we make those increases. And so it may look like we move money towards where it was quote unquote underperforming or not performing as well, but that's where we were able to get the volume at the most efficient possible. So it may be, let's say, ad set B had a $10 cost per purchase and ad set A had a $5 cost per purchase. It may be that audience in ad set A is exhausted. You can't get any more volume there at less than the target, and so money is moved to B. Even though it looks less efficient, it's as efficient as possible between the two. And so it's a tricky concept, the breakdown effect, but it's important that when you are comparing campaign budget optimization, just like Bombas when they did their original test, it's not about breaking it down and looking at the individual pieces. It's looking at the whole. How did cell A, that business as usual cell, do against cell B? That's what you want to compare, not how the individual pieces within each one performed. And that's a tricky concept. Like, I completely understand that. But those tests for quite a long time, Bombas has been doing this for 18 months, have proven time and time again that not only is it more efficient, but it's a lot less work for you. And we think that's as good as it gets.
And Matt, how would you go about implementing CBO?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of call-outs here. So CBO we've seen be widely successful, as Justin mentioned. A couple of things to keep in mind, though. First of all is that CBO, by default, assumes that you are okay with any of the outcomes of the ad sets under that campaign. So, for example, we have some restrictions on the kind of ad sets that can be included together, but even within that, you may have similar, let's say, pixel events, maybe one for add to cart, one for purchase, all together under one campaign. Now, CBO assumes that all of those outcomes you are equally okay with. And so if you find yourself in a position where you said, actually, I value purchase a little bit more than add to cart. Of course, you can represent that through your bid, but if you did not, CBO is not going to be able to differentiate that. And it may give a lot of delivery to add to cart because it may be the most efficient delivery at that price point. So that's a big call out to be aware of. The other thing always to be mindful of CBO is CBO is really efficient at exhausting your budget, which is a great thing for most advertisers. But for other advertisers out there, they use a structure where they don't put in what I would consider a realistic budget. They inflate their budget in order to maximize volume. So for example, an advertiser might say, I have a $10 CPA. and I set $1 million budget. I'm willing to spend $1 million every day. Now the reality is this advertiser never wants to spend $1 million a day, but they just want to get as many conversions up to $10 as they can. If they take that same ad set and move it wholesale into a CBO campaign with that $1 million budget, all of a sudden, we may find other ads in there that we actually can spend on. And so we want to make sure that any budget you're allocating to CBO is realistic. And those are sort of the two big call-outs. But under there, we've seen it perform really well.
And I'll add on to the choosing the right event. That's important everywhere on Facebook. Is we are as good as any at doing what you ask of us, right? So if you say drive add to cars, drive video views, we're going to deliver that maximum volume for you as efficiently as possible. But if we call it like a whisper goal, where you say one thing to the system, you reflect it one way with one bid value or a certain conversion event, but you actually want something else, you're probably not going to drive as much as you otherwise could if you reflected that to our system. So it's important that you bid what your true value is, what you actually are willing to pay, and then you bid for what your actual goal is, what your end goal is. I think for Bombas it'd probably be end purchases or maybe value, the actual maximizing the value, the return on ad spend. But if they said, well, what about website clicks? They drive a ton of traffic to their website, but they may not drive conversions. And so, especially within CBO, it's really, because it can move across some of those objectives, it's really important that you represent to our system what you actually want, because it will try to maximize that volume. If you're kind of misrepresenting, or let's say you're trying to hack the system, which we do encourage people trying to find the best way, but what we've seen is just representing the actual goal is by far the best way to drive that performance, especially when you're using CBO. It's critical because we need to know that end goal so that we can correctly move towards your actual goals and not maybe a misrepresentation into the system.
And something I would just add is like kind of Matt touched on, you can see what your cost is coming in at for all different events. So even if you're optimizing towards purchase, you could get a baseline for what it actually costs you to drive, add to cart, and view content. So when you're starting to think of like how to build out a funnel or how to optimize, you should obviously not bid the same way for a purchase as you would to add to cart. But if you're struggling to get a sense for what it should be, most of these metrics are available in the UI. And it really is helpful because it gives you a baseline for what that market price is for each event. So when you're thinking of how to build out these plans, I would really try to get as granular as possible when trying to strategize what the bids should be.
So Michael, while we're on you, I think you would appreciate this. So Jill has a question. Bombas is a product that everyone needs. What is your opinion about using broad audiences for brands that are more niche?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Justin kind of answered this before, but happy to do it again. So Bombas, I think a lot of why simplification worked to the extent that it did is because we have a mass market product. But as far as broad audiences, it's not so much that it doesn't really matter so much on the product as much as enhancing the conversion signal. So if you're unable to get 50 to 100 purchases, you're probably limited in the delivery based on bid or based on other conflicting audiences that are overlapping. But I've seen broad audiences work for really small businesses, and it's really just a matter of what your signal looks like and what you can do internally to enhance it. So if you're putting constraints on, or if your bid is just not competitive, because broad is a really scary term when you think of a niche. When you build out an ad set and it shows potential reach 200 million people, it really doesn't take into account machine learning and the system being able to identify, okay, after 5 conversions, this is what a Bombas customer looks like, or what a niche customer would look like. Let me go find more of those people. So it doesn't really matter as much on the product, and more so the signal and the system being able to replicate. Within 200 million people, it may only be 1 million, and you may be able to exhaust that audience. But
I think it's a great question, Jill. It's really about. It's less about the actual product itself, and it's more about the setup. So to Jill's point, she may be thinking I have more of a niche product, and so therefore I have to put some targeting on. And we would agree to some extent for certain types of products. Let's say it's something like maternity wear, where you're going to have to apply a gender to your product because that's very clear. But if you go a little bit broader and say, even if it's a real niche product in a certain area of the country or something like that, you still want to think about how our optimization engine works. And if you go broad, like Michael said, it can seem like a scary concept, but actually the optimization, how we are using your conversion signals in order to find the next best person that may purchase your product, that optimization is actually your targeting. That optimization is your targeting choice. And so that means that even if you go broad, we're still only reaching certain people. So sure, you're targeting a very broad audience, but it doesn't matter who you target. It matters who you actually reach with those ads. In our system, what we found is the less constraints you put on it, the better it is at finding those targets. And if we think about consolidation, it's about consolidating those conversion signals so that it gets smarter, gets out of the learning phase quicker, and we're able to find those next best people. It also means you should think about some of our advanced targeting products like lookalike audiences or value-based lookalike audiences, and using some of those as well as those broad audiences so that there are some niche audiences, maybe let's say the 1% lookalike is 2 million people in the US. You may bid a little bit higher for them, or you may have a certain messaging for them. And so within different parts of those targets, we can still add something. We're not asking you to completely go just one ad set, totally broad, nothing else.
Yeah.
It's about how do I minimize the overlap and the redundancies within each group, and make sure that I'm leaning into the optimization as much as possible and not trying to introduce maybe arbitrary interest groups or something like that may not be as may not perform as well as if you just lean into those signal-based audiences like lookalikes.
If we have time, I definitely want to dive deeper into lookalike audiences, but I want to speak about optimization really quick. So we have a question from Courtney J. How can brands better control the amount of spend going to different ad sets as we shift fully into CBO?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say you don't want to, right? And so that's one of the beauties of CBO is we do allow these minimums and maximums to be set, but we'd say that's kind of fighting against campaign budget optimization and what it's really intended to do. So we do give you those controls because we want to make sure that we allow you to have those choices. But if you want to lean into campaign budget optimization in full, you shouldn't want to use them because we want you to trust that the system is going to maximize the volume as much as possible. Now, let's say you have something like only a certain amount of products or a certain number of sales, coupons that you can give out, something like that. That is a place where we want to apply it. But if we're talking general approaches or general sales, we really want to remove those constraints because the less constraints on the system, the more we're able to pool those conversion signals together, and the better the next ad that's served is going to be.
And Matt, this next question is for you from Manolo. I've always heard you should bid 5x your cost per conversion per day. What if we're trying to get to 50 conversions faster? Should we front load budgets to get to 50 faster than scale back based on performance?
Yeah, I think this question probably touches on the learning phase, so might be a good time to talk about what the learning phase is and kind of how we think about it. So to sort of set this up, the learning phase is the period of time that we kind of think of as ad exploration. You've launched a new ad on the system. We want to figure out who to deliver to. And I mentioned earlier, as important of who to deliver to, it's who to not deliver to, right? Who is unlikely to take the action you desire. And so what happens is that early on in the life cycle of an ad, we're unsure of who to deliver to. And because of that, we have a lot of variability, have a high variance in our delivery. And usually you'll see this volatility show up early on where performance will sort of go up and down over time. Very quickly, though, as we land on a number like 50 conversions, we've stabilized performance. And what this means is the performance you kind of see around that point going forward is going to be fairly stable across time, and you can be fairly sure this is the kind of performance you should expect. Now, when you think about a concept like front-loading spend, the idea between front-loading spend, I generally discourage. And the reason why is because what you're doing there is learning on a set of users and learning at a price point which won't be realistic for what you actually want. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes we get the question of, can I sort of, for lack of a better word, juice the learning phase? Can I get out of it quicker and then dial back to something I realistically want? The reality is, when you're doing that, oftentimes what you're doing is learning on a certain set of users as a price point, then learning on a brand new set after you set a realistic budget. Sure. And so our recommendation is always to launch with what you realistically expect to use. Of course, there's lots of situations where you may want to scale up over time because you're seeing great performance, and 100% encourage that. But know that fundamentally, we would not recommend a strategy where you're trying to artificially get out of learning phase faster.
That makes sense. And Michael, back to you. Yeah. We spoke about this a little earlier. How do you go about testing different audiences when you think about LTVs?
Yeah, lookalikes have been great for this. Being able to, I mean, it's tough when we're just judging everything on historical reporting, and you really have to like work with your internal team to see how the behavior and long-term value of some of these customers actually like matures over time. But as far as like being able to find a customer that will potentially be high value, Matt kind of just touched on, like wherever your bid is at now, there is an associated and an assumed value for that user, and you're reporting on what their AOV is, what their lifetime value is. But in order to find potentially high value customers, there is, like if you think of like a bucket, there is another bucket or another tier that you can potentially go to. Lookalikes kind of help you get there a little bit faster because it is taking your existing customers and obviously trying to find ones that match that source file. So as far as like initial short-term gains, you'll probably be able to find more customers with similar lifetime values or higher pretty quickly by utilizing lookalikes, whereas broad is much more of a long-term play because there is that initial exploration stage where you're trying to find what your core customer actually looks like within like a very open and like targeting parameters.
Okay, just want to remind the audience, please keep your questions coming. I'm seeing a lot of really good questions right now. I would say most of the questions are focused around the learning phase and what exactly is broad, right? So can you guys, if you guys don't mind, define how broad is broad?
So broad at its widest, it would be global, anybody, right? And there are actually some advertisers, especially in the mobile app space, where your good is an app, right? So it can be distributed anywhere, any place, and there's no restrictions on it, and that can work. But let's say it's for U.S.-based companies. A broad audience typically would be something like adults 18 plus. Right, okay. Or maybe adults 18 to 45, if you feel like that's the audience that you see most of your conversions coming from. But generally, 18 plus would be the broadest definition of broad. But if we think about simplification, we wouldn't want to just create that one ad set. We would want to try out some of the other advanced signal-based, so using those lookalikes or value-based lookalikes, and trying out maybe a 1% and a 10%, something like that gives our system a little bit of preference to start with. So it's saying, sure, we'll take everyone, but we also want to maybe bid a little bit higher for someone that may be in this audience because they may be more valuable. Like Michael was saying, those lookalikes may have longer lifetime value, in which case you'll actually bid more for them you'll pay maybe $20 to acquire them for their first purchase because they're more likely to make purchases down the line, versus a broader audience, you may only want to spend $10 because they're less likely to make a purchase further down the line.
Okay, so going back to your point, Michael, it sounds like you definitely want to have at least two strategies, right?
Yeah,
you want to have broad, you want to have the higher LTV.
Definitely. I think, one, it's a great way to get a baseline on how your lookalikes working and to be able to have something to comp. So again, reviewing the behavior of the broad audience, sometimes I've run tests where the AOV and the conversion rate and all the key metrics that we're judging performance on are exactly the same as a lookalike, just over time, right? So that initial learning stage, the lookalike almost 9 out of 10 times outperforms the broad within that first learning stage because it's a closer match. But over time, we start to see the system really learn who to show ads to, and it's more of like a baseline comp.
Yeah. Along that point, what has been your experience, Michael, around having multiple lookalikes?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I would say in order to do it, and it kind of is somewhat connected to automatic placements. In order to do it, it's how distinctly different are the lookalikes, because then you're just adding more redundancies than like we're trying to remove with consolidation. But if you see that the signal and the purchasing behavior is very different on a lookalike built off of add to carts compared to the last 30-day purchasers, then it like warrants kind of breaking it out. And again, you could bid differently, you could kind of like stack them, but if it all kind of looks the same, consolidation is what I would recommend.
And Matt, when we talk about redundancies, how can redundancies have a negative impact?
Yeah, so one of the things that happens in our system is we have a process known as deduplication. And so deduplication means that if an advertiser is going to submit multiple ads for an individual auction, so basically to one person on our platform at a given time, we're only going to allow one ad from that advertiser to deliver. Now there's some constraints on that. Usually we're thinking about page ID or app ID as sort of being the shared level there as well. But because of that, we're doing this again as a protection mechanism, because otherwise, based on our auction, we wouldn't want an advertiser competing with themselves to deliver to someone. So we're only sending one forward. So in the case of overlapping audiences, oftentimes what can happen is by setting those up, fundamentally one of those ads is going to be unable to deliver because one of the ads will dominate delivery. And so oftentimes this is really tough to figure out as an advertiser of when you see that overlap. And in those cases, we want to try to minimize that as much as possible so that we can be really clear about where delivery is going. That said, there are cases where you may be okay with overlap. The fundamental thing I like to think about is overlap on its own might not necessarily be bad. It's only bad when you're not aware that it's happening. So if you're thinking really carefully and you realize that two different groups might overlap, that can be okay. But it's when we don't realize that two different groups do, and in fact cause some of this deduplication, that it can be a challenge to getting delivery.
And I would say the awareness is probably like the most important thing. And back when we kind of rolled out the test plan, the product team hadn't unveiled this yet, but now you can actually see how overlap's impacting your performance with the delivery insights tool. So if you inspect, you'll be able to see how many of your ads were kicked out of an auction by your competing ad sets. And I think when you're reporting on creative tests and whatnot and trying to decide what's actually working, it's really important to understand how overlap may be playing a role into that, because based on that time and that person, you may have shown a different ad to someone who is more likely to convert. So now, the other ad was not only kicked out of the auction, but is then delivered to someone who may have less intent. So if that performance is a little bit worse, it's not necessarily that, one ad is superior to the other. It's just at that given moment. So that's why when you're consolidating or thinking about your tests, you want to keep overlap in mind. Again, it's not really a bad thing, but when you're trying to see the impact on performance, you number one, just be aware of it. And Facebook continues to roll out products that gives the user and the account manager more insight to what's going on.
Yeah. Matt, can you explain real quick what it means to be kicked out the auction? Right? If you have two ads competing against each other, how does that process work?
Yeah, so I'll cover it at a high level. So at a high level, the way our auction works can be considered or thought of like a second price auction. It's not exactly, but it's a great mental model for how to think about it. And so if you think about how a second price auction works, what this would mean is that you would pay the price of the next highest bidder. So for example, Chidi, if I had an ad that I want to deliver, I'm willing to pay $100, you have an ad for $10 that you want to deliver, I'm actually going to win because I'm willing to pay more, but I'm only going to pay your price of $10, right? So in that example, that is how a second price auction would work. Now, if you imagine I, as one advertiser, have both a $100 ad and a $95 ad, right? What I would not want to happen is that I actually second price myself, meaning that I'm charging myself $95 because that was the other ad. Instead, I would only rather compete against those other advertisers. So really, when we say kicked out of the auction, it's really just a protection mechanism to make sure that advertisers are not increasing their own prices by competing against themselves.
Okay. And I want to spend the last few moments on the learning phase, right? Because we mentioned it earlier, but can we dive a little deeper? What is that learning phase exactly, and how can we avoid it? Can it be avoided?
Unfortunately, cannot be avoided.
Okay. Should somebody want to be able to avoid it?
I don't think so, because our learning phase is really built around helping to understand what kind of ads are going to perform best for certain people. And so the learning phase, I touched on this earlier, is really a couple things. First, it's just exploration, right? It's the initial exploration of the new ad that we have, or probably most importantly for a lot of folks, it's a change that you've made in the system. So for example, if you've edited the creative, we will re-enter that ad into the learning phase because we have to relearn who that ad is going to respond to. So on that front, the learning phase is really just this period of time at the beginning where we're exploring who to deliver to. You're generally going to see high volatility in performance, meaning it might be great performance one day, worse performance the next, and over time you'll see that performance stabilize. And once that performance stabilizes, that's when we say it's out of the learning phase, and we really know who's going to respond to that particular ad. One thing I always like to call out here, though, to be crystal clear on, we're always learning about ads, right? So it's not like we have the learning phase and then we stop. We continue to learn throughout time. However, the learning phase is just this initial kickoff and exploration.
So for us over here, Justin, Matt, we see a lot of data come through and we understand the value of the learning phase. But let's hear from Michael. What are your thoughts about the learning phase?
Yeah. At Bombas, we don't try to avoid the learning stage as much as being aware of it and trying to time it accurately. My favorite stat that came from our QBR last year was our ads spent 3% of all of last year in the learning stage. And that was, like Matt just said, it's constantly learning and it's not something that can be avoided. But as far as like expectations on performance, you should be aware that there may be some volatility early on, and that's just like, again, the discovery stage. I would say like you want to be cognizant of that, and also being able to not tinker with like optimizations early on, as hard as it may be. If you just like the example, you launch an ad with $100 budget, you spent $80 and you're not seeing the initial results, and you change the budget or change the bid, that is, in my eyes, considered like wasted ad spend, because now it's like back to the learning. So when we launched that test, it was hard, mainly because it was so like performance was great and we wanted to up the budgets. But you kind of like, regardless of performance, we would have sat back and let Facebook come out of the learning stage before adjusting anything, because we want the inefficiencies that can sometimes be accompanied with learning to be worth it in the long term. So any tinkering in the early stages are only like resetting the learning, and if you time it correctly, you can kind of avoid it at times where the signal may not be as strong.
I appreciate you sharing that with us, because it's really hard for some of us to just sit back and let the learning phase do what it does best, right? Matt, you want to chime in on that? So, learning phase, what kind of changes actually disrupt the learning phase?
Well, one thing I'll say before we go into it, I think we hit on an excellent point, which is it's probably actually tougher to not make changes than to make them, right? The natural thing is to go into the system and constantly edit things, right? It's actually much tougher to sit back, have faith, and watch it run. So definitely sympathize with anyone out there who's saying, hey, I want to be in this every day and making these changes constantly, because it is really tough sometimes to let it run. In terms of what makes or what re-enters the learning phase or causes the learning phase to occur. Of course, a brand new ad, but that one's probably pretty obvious. However, the other ones really focus around more or less any change to the setup of the ad. What I mean by this is, with the exception of bid and budget, and there are some caveats there, pretty much any change we make to the ad will re-enter it into the learning phase, right? So changing the creative, changing the copy, changing the optimization type, changing the targeting, all will cause us to re-enter into the learning phase and have to re-explore what kind of delivery, what kind of individual is going to respond to this particular ad.
Definitely. So one important question is, because Matt, I know you speak to small, medium-sized businesses all the time. Justin, I know you also do the same thing. How can they compete in the auction? Because if we're talking about bidding budgets, like, wouldn't the larger advertisers technically win? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so everyone competes equally in the auction, right? There's one auction for everyone. It's not there's no special flag for the size of advertiser, right? In terms of performance, we see lots of small advertisers outperforming larger ones. And one of the reasons why is a couple of things. One is that as you have a small budget, as Justin mentioned earlier, we always give you the most efficient delivery first, right? So we're always, no matter what advertiser you are in our system, we're giving you the most efficient delivery possible. And so with a small budget, that means that delivery is really efficient, right? Because we only have so much of it we can utilize. And so within that also, we find small advertisers do a great job around understanding their audience and delivering a really relevant message to that particular group, right? So there are benefits of being able to stay fairly nimble and focus on a really narrow audience. So those are some things we see in terms of how that competition works. But I would say overall in our system, we see lots of small advertisers succeed, and in fact, I think that's why we see so many folks grow on Facebook as a platform itself, right? Disruptors, from the very beginning, growing on Facebook to build out their entire business. And I think the reason you can do that on our platform is because of that fairness across the system.
Yeah, and it's about that fairness is why this topic is so interesting to me and to Matt and to a lot of the people here at Facebook is whether you're big or small, you are all competing for that same impression. And so, if you're a huge brand and you want to reach everyone in the U.S., you're going to have to be more valuable, right? For that ad to be inserted into someone's feed than say a bike store around the corner for a user, and that means that user value, what our users are getting from us, we want ads to be an incremental value to the people and the experience that they're having on our platform, because that means they're kind of not ads anymore. They're just really good content that is helping you discover the world around you. And so small businesses are such a huge part of our auction, and why these concepts, why we're changing from just these in-person breakthrough events and bringing it to something like this is we think that they're valuable for everybody out there. So whether you're big or small, everything we've talked about today does apply to you. And because you are all you're all competing on the same footing within the auction, and so we're going to make sure that everyone has these best practices so that everyone can put their best foot forward.
And I want to focus on, Mike, I'll get right back to you. I want to focus on Liu's question really quick, because she was speaking about the competitiveness of small advertisers versus some of the larger advertisers. There's also other things we're looking at when you think about bidding budgets, right? There's also, what else goes into that auction formula, right? Are we taking other things into consideration?
Yeah, so one of the major components is the expected action rate. So if you are trying to drive a conversion, drive a purchase, it's how are we're trying to predict the future and whether it's likely that someone is going to take that action. We talk about the learning phase, why making those changes resets it, or we have to go back through it, is because now you've changed all the conditions underneath. And so we're trying to reach new people at a new cost or with new creative, and so our ability to actually predict the future changes. And so that expected conversion rate, that volatility that Matt talked about, shrinks. The range of the prediction shrinks, and that's a good thing, right? Your confidence intervals are getting tighter, and that means that we're better predicting the future, and that means we can be more accurate and less wasteful with every single impression that we serve out there. And so the expected conversion rate is definitely a big one. And do you want to talk about user value?
Well, I'll add a little bit more on action rate first. I would say on the action rate side, one of the really valuable things in our system is differentiation. Right? So the ability to look at different people on our platform and bid differently, and we do a lot of that through the action rate. Right. So if someone is very likely to take the action you desire, you're going to have a much more competitive bid with them than somebody who is unlikely to take that action. So one of the fundamental things we're doing there is making that separation, and that's what you see the learning phase doing, being able to make that differentiation among people on our platform. The other component, as Justin was mentioning, is user value. This may be thought of in the past as something like relevance score, which we since sort of changed, but know that a big component of what we're thinking about as well is how that content resonates in someone's feed or someone's timeline when they're seeing an ad. And exactly aligned with what Justin was saying, we want all pieces of content to feel very organic, to feel like something your friends might have shared. And so really, we don't want there to be necessarily a distinction between, oh, this is definitely an ad, and this is not. We want it all to feel like one continuous part of the experience on our platform. And so because of that, we consider how people are responding to that creative, to that content in their feed, in our formulas of calculating value.
Let me go back a bit to the expected conversion rates. I think it's important to note that bid and budget, when we talk about big advertisers, small advertisers, if you say a large advertiser, a multinational brand, may be able to bid higher, or their budgets are higher, something like that. That doesn't, of course, if you're willing to pay more, you'll get some preference inside the system. However, those estimated conversion rates are a great equalizer. One, it's important that you represent the action that you want. So you can't trick the system by, say, moving the conversion rate up funnel and trying to get a whole bunch of actions for something that's not your intended goal, because you're just going to optimize towards something that isn't that focus. But it also means that we can sell for Bombas, selling socks, and now expanding where they're going with that, or selling a mattress, right?
Okay.
So selling socks and selling mattresses, probably very different price points, but that expected conversion rate is the equalizer between that.
Yeah.
So they may need to bid higher, but if you have more action, I talked about the bike shop around the corner that maybe is trying to drive people in store, or trying to drive some video views of an event they had this weekend. The expected action rate for that ad may be much, much higher than the big brand, right? And so that conversion rate is a lot about the quality, about the relevance to the user. And what we found, to bring this all the way back to simplification, is the broader the audience they have, actually the better we are at predicting those conversion rates, because you're removing those constraints. Our systems have got so good at looking across broader audiences and finding those people likely to take the action that we don't need as much targeting like maybe we used to a few years ago in order to drive those maximum outcomes. And when I say drive maximum outcomes, I mean predict what's going to actually happen, and then it actually does happen. So we've tightened and heightened our ability to be able to do that.
And we have some great case studies to support what you just said. Michael, I want to give you an opportunity to.
I thought it was a great question. So, there's a lot of thoughts there, and I think my experience, even prior to Bombas, is kind of relevant to this question, because I came where I was working on accounts where we were only spending $100 to $200 a day, and in those situations, it can be overwhelming to try to compete with some of the largest advertisers in the world on the platform. I think Facebook does a great job of kind of even in the playing field by considering the other things, like in the total value that Justin and Matt just spoke to. I think when you don't have that really high monetary bid, you should try to button up some of the other experiences for the user. So make sure, like, some of the smallest advertisers have the best creative because they're so focused on creating engaging content, and that does have, like, obviously a factor. And then what Justin just said about the expected conversion rate, if an advertiser, to some point, if an advertiser is going into the auction bidding $1,000, but they're driving to a site that just doesn't convert, over time they may get some initial delivery, but over time the system is not going to continue to serve ads because it's focused on the user's experience. So if they're not taking the action rate that the person's bidding on, regardless of how high this bid may be, we kind of see it, advertisers see it on a day-to-day basis. If you looked at what your bid is on really cold traffic compared to retargeting people, you could have the same exact bid, but because the estimated conversion rate is so different for someone who's been to your site and has some intent compared to someone who's never heard of you, you're able to spend a lot more with that retargeting audience because your overall value in the auction is significantly higher. So I think there are a lot of levers to play with in some sense, and just having a great overall site experience and great creative really can be some of the distinguishing factors in the auction besides just a monetary bid.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we're running out of time. I just want to give you guys all an opportunity to answer one more question.
Sure.
And that's, if you could leave the audience with one key takeaway, what would it be? Let's start with you, Michael.
Yeah, so I would think the biggest challenge with having an advertiser introduce simplification is, and we went through it too, when performance is okay, it's hard to really rock the boat. And meaning that you really don't want to change everything. It can be scary to consolidate and go all in on a few ad sets. I would challenge them to really think of what your goals are and how can you smash those goals. So last year we were able to increase our spend on the platform by 80%, right, at the same efficiency. And those, we were able to accomplish that by consolidating. And I've said a few times, consolidation and simplification and utilizing some of the things we talked about today will really unleash the platform in a way that just wasn't capable prior with all the constraints. So if there was one takeaway, it's just take some of the constraints off and you'll be rewarded for it. Every advertiser is different, and the amount of risk that you can tolerate is obviously different, but just be strategic in your testing and kind of lean, like at Bombas, we try to lean into the machine learning as much as possible while still like making optimizations where they're needed.
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, certainly our machine learning has gotten so much more powerful over the years, and I only expect it to continue to increase. So the efforts towards simplification, consolidation are only going to continue being more and more important here, right? So they're very important today, they'll be more important in the future. And I like to think of it this way. If your account is not set up to be scaled or to be thought of as an account that is really positioned well to grow. To do this, you need to have a great foundation. And to me, the foundation of the account is sort of built around having a simplified structure. It's all about starting out, simplifying down, and then expanding from there as needed. So I always like to say, I work with many different advertisers. When I come in and see, 50% or more of spend in the learning phase, I'm always focused on, hey, let's get that down to a small number like you heard here today. 3% or anything, honestly, under 20% I think is really great. And so getting that foundation right opens up a multitude of opportunities for other kinds of tests and other ways you can think about strategy to really build going forward. So it would be just the message that we're going to continue improving our machine learning, and so know that this is a really important topic and something that you should definitely be focused on.
I'll add on to what Matt said and say a big takeaway is, what are you going to do with all the time that you'll get back? If we talk about 90% less time spent in optimizations, think about your resources, not just from your investment levels, but from the time that you have to commit to our system. And whether you are a large or small advertiser, time is really finite for everybody. And so how can we give you more of that back? That's what this program, with this approach, this way of thinking about our platform is about. And using that time to add the incremental value to your business. And it's, we're of the opinion that making optimizations within our system, finding the right people, moving budgets around, all of those things, Facebook is uniquely positioned to be able to make those decisions for you and still maximize the outcomes. And our advertisers are uniquely positioned to be able to tell stories about their business and figure out how to connect with their customers better. And so if we each play those parts, we're able to get a greater sum. And so really focus on your resources, time being a big component of that, and how to maximize the value for your business.
Yeah, I mean, that was excellent. Really appreciate you guys providing those takeaways. Just want to thank you, Justin, Matt, Michael. Really appreciate you being here. For everybody out there, please continue asking your questions. That will actually determine what our next episode will be. Again, this is episode 10. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you tuning in. And I'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.